Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Hello, welcome everyone, whether that might be in the morning or afternoon, evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. I'd like to officially say welcome, as I know there is that lag between joining a Zoom and actually getting here, but I'll just start things off so we can stay on time in terms of our presentation hour today. So again, a very big welcome and thank you to all for joining us in today's webinar, The Gig Economy Recommendations for Practice. My name is Elizabeth White and I'm the Learning and Development Team Lead with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'm here today to help host and moderate today's webinar. I'll just start off by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We would like to thank our academic team and 9 founding partner organizations in the Harnessing Talent Project, Harnessing Talent Alliance for Recruiting and Retaining Canadians with Disabilities and Mental Health Challenges is a 3-year project funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. This webinar is made possible through the support of ESDC, as well as memberships to the Work Wellness Institute. And of course, we'd like to take a quick second and thank our advisory committee, as well as our speakers who contribute to this webinar. And without them, we wouldn't have this programming. So thank you very much to them. I'm just going to take a quick minute around technical housekeeping points so we're all on the same page on how to interact today. Hopefully at this point you're able to hear me as well as see our title slide on the screen, whether that's through your computer or perhaps a conference line if you chose to dial in today. We do ask that all participants remain muted throughout the presentation. And for those that require it or is a helpful tool for you, please note that we do have the closed caption function option available to you. That should be shown in your bottom menu, and you just simply click on the CC button to turn that on. In terms of your ways to communicate with us, we do want to identify that there are 2 avenues. So we do have the chat function, which you're probably all very familiar with, and again would be found in that bottom screen toolbar. And so for the chat, that's open to all. You can put in your comments or thoughts, anything you want to share with the group. If you're having technical difficulties, you can reach out to myself or my colleague Emma. We'll have the WWI in brackets beside our name, so you can find us should you be having any difficulties. And there will be an FAQ sheet popped into the chat. It may already be there for any of those quick tips around technical or anything that you might be bubbling with questions already around how today's webinar is going to go. I would also like to bring your attention to the Q&A, literally called Q&A, question and answer function, also within that toolbar at the bottom. We will be having a dedicated Q&A with our wonderful speaker today. And so we just encourage you to use the question and answer function for that period. No need to hold back. If you have questions as you are listening to the presentation today, please just type them in and we'll just have them all ready to go for that dedicated question and answer at the end of the session today. And I will note that with the Q&A, you can put in a private question as well as anonymous if that feels more comfortable for you to use it in that way. If there's any questions maybe bubbling around what's next after this webinar, just a reminder that this is a recorded session, and the presentation as well as the presentation materials will be emailed to you for your participation at the end or after those materials are available, and will be emailed directly to you. As well, it will be posted within our eCampus, which you can find through our website. A last quick note to our Work Wellness Institute members, just a reminder that you will receive your free certificate of attendance automatically for your participation in today's webinar. Thank you for indulging those few minutes of housekeeping, and now we get to go into our main event. I'm very excited to have Dr. Emily Campion with us today. Emily is an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship in the Tippie College of Business at the University of Iowa. Her research falls under the Future of Work umbrella and includes topics related to machine learning and natural language processing and personnel selection, alternative gig and remote work experiences, and workforce diversity and representation. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Applied Psychology, Journal of Management, Leadership Quarterly, and Journal of Vocational Behavior. Emily is currently serving as an editorial board member for Journal of Applied Psychology and Personnel Psychology. Prior to academia, she was a daily reporter in Indiana and an AmeriCorps member in Washington, D.C. She earned her bachelor's in journalism from Indiana University and her Ph.D. in organization and human resources from the University of Buffalo, the State University of New York. Thank you so much for providing your time and expertise to our audience today, and I'm very excited to be passing things to you and taking away the presentation.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Emma, for the chance to talk on this topic, a topic I love very much. I like this note from one of the participants already for where you are. I'm coming to you from Iowa City, and if you have no idea where that is, like me, before I moved here, it is 3 hours west of Chicago. And you might think Iowa is very flat. It's not, I promise you. Lots of hills, lots of good hiking. Nothing like Vancouver, as Emma and Elizabeth and I have already talked about, but that's where I'm coming to today. So we're going to talk about this, our evolving understanding of the gig economy and its players. This is something, as you guys know, this term came around, many years ago, and it's sort of amorphous a little bit, and it's sometimes treated as a monolith. But my colleagues and I have been doing some research, trying to figure this group out a little bit better, and I'll be presenting that research to you today. So my first question is, my only question for you guys at this point, unfortunately, is what do you think of when you hear gig worker? And I do believe we hopefully have a poll set up, but perhaps we did. There it is. Thank you. You guys are magic. So I do allow you to pick more than one option here, if you would. So what do you think when you're a gig worker? Do you think of people who work short-term jobs that are paid by project? Do you think mostly of only people who work for like Uber and Upwork or Fiverr? Do you think of vulnerable workers who do lots of jobs to make ends meet? Or it's hard to say, but I know it when I see it.
Answers are coming in, so we'll just give a few more seconds as people click
you.
away.
Great, thank you.
Okay, looks like we are good to go. So I'll share those results for the group.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Oh, it popped up and then it went away, but I think, oh, there it is. Okay, great. I actually expected more people to say the last one. This is great. All right, so about 100% of the people said short-term jobs that are paid by project. Well, you guys already know, you don't need me to tell you anything else. Why am I here? Great. People who do work, okay, and then vulnerable workers. Awesome. Thank you so much for participating in that. Let's talk about this. We have in our science now, there have been, definitions elsewhere, but some colleagues of mine have published research now culminating everything that we possibly can in the literature, across literatures, not just management, not just psych, but anything possibly can pull from, economic sociology, anthropology on what is gig work. And they came up with 4 dimensions of a gig work, 4 characteristics of it, and a scientific definition for it. So these are individuals who are not employees of an organization. That should not surprise anyone. Classification plays a big role, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. They do gigs or projects that are short term. In fact, the term gig comes mostly from the music world, right? And then their payment is project based. And finally, they sell their labor directly to the market. So the technical definition we're going to work with today is gig work is labor contracted and compensated on a short-term basis to organizations or to individual clients through an external labor market. And some of these types of jobs should come to mind. Uber Eats or whatever type of, food delivery service. Dog walking obviously is a common one, the music that I mentioned already, but also these more, higher skilled professional jobs with individuals who are, freelancers, and again, not employed, which does have implications for, their legal right to benefits and such. So when we think about gig work, we often have to think about it in contrast to what we'll call traditional labor, or a typical employee. A typical employee, you can see here in the middle, the employee has a supervisor, co-workers, or and peers, and then either subordinates if they're potentially middle managers, or clients. Meanwhile, gig workers sort of have the same setup, except the arrows can go either direction. So I actually took those arrows out. In a lot of ways, especially with freelancers, feels more like B2B, right? So you've got a freelancer who might do some sort of copy editing. They do this with several clients. So they're actually they're selling their labor directly to the market. And this creates a lot of, we'll say, problems in research, because most of our research is done in terms of management and IO psychology on the typical employee, which you see here on the left in all yellow. That's what we typically research. We research that employee in the middle, and we research their relationships with individuals around them and how all of these things influence their performance. Gig work is a little more complicated because they tend to have short-term relationships. How do those relationships look different? They're not employees. What does commitment then look like? They don't have organizational commitment, maybe, but they have occupational commitment. And how are those things driving their behaviors differently toward predicting performance? So the big question at the very beginning of this research, which one of the earliest papers I've been able to find is from the early 1960s by a labor economist, I believe, named Walensky. He wrote essentially that individuals do gig work, are moonlighters. Now, this is a little different. Moonlighters are individuals who work, a second job in addition to their full-time job, suggesting they do it at night when they're not working their full-time day job. However, we do see a lot of individuals who are what we call multiple job holders, who are moonlighters, are doing gig work on the side. So a lot of this research goes together. So Walensky said, basically these individuals fall into what we call the deprivation constraint hypothesis. They're economically squeezed, they're socially deprived, they don't have a lot of social contacts, and they're taxed for their energy and time. And a lot of that notion around their vulnerability is really drawing from this hypothesis that the reason they're doing this type of labor is because they don't have maybe the skills, the network, the whatever it may be to actually get a full-time traditional job. And we work under the assumption falsely often that that's what everybody wants. Meanwhile, there's been this other stream that's been developing called this energic opportunity hypothesis. A researcher by last name Jamal did 3 studies in the 80s and 90s to just answer the question for himself. And he found in his research that this was more supported in his studies. He said the individuals who moonlight or do this type of additional labor, they have more energy, they have higher social and economic expectations, they voluntarily exert a higher level of energy and effort. He even goes to call them, they're a special breed, they're just something different. And that's really what's motivating these types of workers. And this notion, this energic opportunity hypothesis notion, is in the zeitgeist too. I don't know if you guys remember this marketing campaign out of Fiverr from 2017. I think I was just starting my dissertation at the time, and I saw this and I couldn't help myself. I was like, I've got to understand freelancers now, because this is just, I wasn't a marketing major, but I thought this was so cool. So the notion here was that they were differentiating between individuals who are dreamers and doers. And doers were hustlers, and doers were those individuals who were gonna, take on a lot of, these tiny projects and make it for themselves, taking this very self-determined lens to work rather than considering sort of social structures that influence our opportunity. The thing that really caught people about this marketing campaign, I think after the initial, I'm a doer, I'm not a dreamer, or whatever reaction people had to it, there was then this, and you might recall this exact, this picture going around a lot. You eat coffee for lunch, you follow through on your follow through, sleep deprivation is your drug of choice. You might be a doer. And this individual wrote, the gig economy is killing us. This is a terrible campaign. But this speaks to sort of all of these ideas we have around freelancing and the gig economy that we just don't fully understand. This campaign, which was supposed to celebrate this sort of autonomy and self-determination and taking things into your own hands. They maybe potentially went an inch too far and went on to say that there's value or valor in suffering through this, and workers in this economy, the gig economy, were saying, actually, this might be the case, but it shouldn't be. This shouldn't be celebrated. So this has brought us to a lot of the research questions that my colleagues and I have been trying to answer, not just around sort of why they do it, which is one thing we do talk about, but also how we can group these people in meaningful ways. Remember that the gig economy is not new. It feels brand new to us. It shouldn't at this point. It's 2023. We've been using this term a long time, but it feels like it maybe doesn't date back very far. But if we think through, North American history and a lot of history actually across the world, we had, pre-industrial revolution, a lot of it was farming communities, agricultural communities selling or trading what their services, their products in the market, and then getting what they needed from then the market and coming home. So anyways, there was this more of a trading of specialized skills, apprenticeship models of training the next generation of, farmers, for example. And then everyone moved into, or not everyone, but a lot of people moved into massive organizations then and during the Industrial Revolution. And over time, we have continued with this notion that we're going to go into an organization when we either graduate or we just leave school or whatever we do, whatever that looks like for us. We're going to get into an organization and we're going to move up in that organization, and we're going to stay in that organization through the rest of our career. Now, obviously, that does happen for some people, but we're starting to move away from this a little bit more and move toward what's on the right here is this gig labor, which is, I've just a couple examples here, the cleaning obviously being gig work, or Uber Eats, which is my attempt at Uber Eats here at the bottom with the icons in PowerPoint. But we've moved away from this a little bit more. And a lot of this has been brought on by, it sounds so silly to say, but like the internet. The internet's been around, a long time, and we would think that it's not still having this just massive effect, but it is in so many parts of our lives, including access to work. As if you have, as long as you've got a stable internet connection and some skill to sell, you can do it online from your house, from a coffee shop, from a co-working studio, from a bench outside. You can do it, and as long as there's, internet outside. You get what I'm saying? That as long as you have this, now it has become hugely accessible. And that has been almost sort of the mantra of gig economy over time, has been like, okay, it has some flaws, but it's so accessible. And that comes into play a little bit later when we talk about whether or not the gig economy actually does offer all it argue it is supposed to offer, especially for individuals with disabilities and the like. So when my colleague and I started this paper many years ago, actually, this is part of my dissertation, and then she and I, this is my colleague, Bori Chilak, she's at Oregon State University. And she and I just wanted to get this basic understanding of like, why are people doing it? Is it really categorized as just money versus they just have extra energy? That felt overly simplified and not fully leveraging everything we know about human behavior. We also wanted to create these subgroups because we were doing interviews, we were talking to people. She was working on her own research in this space with freelancers, and we were getting a sense that there were sort of these latent groupings of individuals, not necessarily by their occupations, which is one reasonable and meaningful way to group individuals by what they do for work, but by sort of these more psychological drivers. So we thought, I wonder if like we could group individuals according to what's driving them toward taking on, additional labor in this way and engaging in the gig economy. And the third thing we wanted to see is if those latent variables, those latent types had any predictive validity. So it's cool if they break up into meaningful groups, but if those groups aren't showing any differences in experiences, then maybe they're not all that meaningful to understand. So this was our three-study project, and also three-pronged approach to try and understand them a little bit better. So the first thing we did, besides coming up with these drivers, is actually break them into these categories using a method called latent profile analysis. If there are any researchers out there, it's a fun method. And so if you're interested, shoot me an email, we can talk coding. But we were able to break all of these motivations into these 4 types of individuals. So these are essentially categories of individuals according to what drives them toward this behavior. And I am not very creative. So the names of these groupings, I totally give Bori all credit possible because she's much more creative than I am. So the first group we found, this was the largest this group, which we called identity builders. So these are individuals who engage in the gig economy because they have this some sort of intrinsic interest in the jobs themselves. They're looking for some sort of career development opportunity. We saw this with especially individuals who might do gig work like adjunct teaching, right? They've got this skill. They wanted to continue to develop and make sure they're rooted in the literature as they try to apply those best practices to their organizational job, for example. And this group also loved flexibility. They loved the flexibility that came with gig economy, which again continues to come up as this hugely important thing, but comes with its own challenges, of course. The second group we found are what we call value optimizers. And so these were really individuals who prioritized the value of career development, the value of that flexibility, and then the money. You'll notice that money didn't really appear with the identity builders. They were not really motivated by the extra cash that might come with doing this in addition to another job. The money wasn't the biggest thing. And it was valuable to those value optimizers, which is why we call them value optimizers, but it wasn't the first thing. The third group we found are what we call pragmatic enjoyment seekers. So it was extra cash and they also enjoyed the work. So one individual that comes to mind that I interviewed, she had her own like Etsy store where she created, I don't remember what craft she was skilled at doing, but she did that. And then on the side, she was a waitress. And I said, is it something about waitressing you love? She goes, yeah, I love it. I get to talk to people, I get to make extra cash, which is really great. But like most of my other work is independent and by myself. And so I get to go and hang out with people and like make sure they have a good meal. Like I find that totally fun. So for her and for others like her, that money and that interest in the work was really driving them. And then you have this fourth group. Now we did this across a couple samples. And so in the first sample, we found what we call instrumentalists. They were mostly doing it for the money, but they weren't too depleted from it. In the second sample, we call them precarious workers because it was only money. And so this group we sort of put together as being either, instrumentalists, being very strategic about the work that they were choosing to take on, and being mostly motivated by that financial factor. And then the precarious workers, similarly, almost entirely motivated by money. So you'll recall the next thing we really cared about was, okay, this is cool. This is really it's great that we can break them up in these meaningful subgroups, but do they actually experience their work differently at all? And we found that they did. Thankfully, that helped us get it published. So identity builders, they derive the highest level of meaning from their work. And that's why I put an artist here as an example. They were highly engaged in their work. They had the highest levels of skill development, and they reported the highest levels of creative idea generation. And they were moderately depleted by the work. Now that depletion plays an interesting role because we know there are downsides to being incredibly engaged in our work, that we can sometimes be more depleted than someone who's not fully engaged in their work. So we did see that they were depleted moderately by the labor they were doing, but they otherwise, on all these sort of positive indicators of experience, they were scoring like the highest. The second are what we're calling, like I mentioned, these value optimizers, that money and career development and flexibility, they definitely derive meaning from their work, but not the highest level. They reported very high levels of skill development, and that makes sense because they're these value optimizers. They reported wanting to gain skills for career development purposes. They also reported high levels of creative idea generation. And again, that moderate depletion came into play. And then we have pragmatic enjoyment seekers. Again, they really loved the work. They wanted to do the work, but they had to be pragmatic about it, and it was still financially motivated. These were really interesting because they were highly engaged and they had moderate levels of these other predictors or other indicators of positive work experiences, but they were the least depleted of their work, of these first three of all the work groups, of all the work groups, they were the least depleted, which is just so interesting that it wouldn't be the identity builders. It wouldn't be those people who were just fully engaged with their labor, with everything they could possibly have and possibly give to it. And it's actually these folks who are just like the woman I mentioned. She's like, yeah, I do that for a little bit extra cash. And so I can like hang out with people and chat with people and be fulfilled, socially in the way I want to be fulfilled. So they were the least depleted. And then, as you'd expect, these instrumentalist / precarious workers, they had the lowest levels of all the positive outcomes, and they were the most depleted group. And this is really important to think about the takeaways from this, because in the zeitgeist, like I mentioned, there's this notion that these gig workers are all vulnerable and we need to protect them and keep them from, from not having access to all these things that, employed workers get, such as benefits and things like that. But actually the bigger takeaway, a sort of high level takeaway from this is they're not necessarily as vulnerable as we thought. There are vulnerable members of the gig economy. I do not want to mince words on that. Absolutely. And there are things that in research, we should be doing more research to understand interventions to get them into the type of labor they want to work in. A lot of the individuals who were part of that precarious group had noted in their comments of the survey or whatnot that they were actively looking for full-time employment. They wanted full-time employment, and that actually gig work and creating this mosaic of jobs was simply a way to make ends meet, and they had to do it, and they really preferred full-time employment. So those individuals do exist. This was the smallest group of our groupings, but nevertheless a meaningful group that requires more attention in research and in practice. This also allowed us to better understand that there's this value beyond autonomy. When we talk about gig work and talk about freelancing, I think for a lot of us, we think flexibility, we think autonomy, but there's these other benefits and skill development. So my other parts of my research are closer to what I'd call traditional HR topics like personnel selection. And so I care a lot about how people are gaining skills. And that's one of the reasons that I became interested in this group to begin with, because it gives into this idea that people are totally in charge of their own skill development these days, as opposed to relying on an organization to tell them when it's time that they need to be trained on this so that they can be promoted. And so I was attracted to this notion of the gig economy, that people were actually doing it for themselves. And we did see this notion that people were not only attracted to the gig economy to do that, but they were actually gaining skills in it. And there's some research by another colleague of mine, Hudson Sessions, who has found that, yes, there can be this spillover of skill I learn in job A, I'm actually applying to job B. But again, like I mentioned, that vulnerability is still here. That pay volatility, which is in many ways still a hallmark, even for those who are taking away these positive things from the experience, they still face this pay volatility. They still face things like status inconsistency between their jobs, which can create strain as they try to move between their jobs. And then in some ways, they're doing just more than a traditional worker. Sometimes, traditional workers, they go to work at a certain time and they leave at a certain time and they don't bring their work home with them. That's not always the case. In fact, I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar probably bring their work home with them. But in many ways, gig work is if I'm taking a break, I'm not earning money. And that can be very, not only is that psychologically taxing, but over time, if you're not taking the time you need to recover from work, that can lead to burnout. Because of this notion, because of these concerns around the more vulnerable of those workers, I have some colleagues here, one of our graduate students, love promoting graduate student work, and one of my colleagues, Jennifer, they are working on some research to try and understand patterns of disclosure. So under what conditions do individuals typically disclose to companies that they might have a gig job on the side? They might have a small business on the side or some entrepreneurial venture, or even those where it's not always that positive. They're working something else on the side because they need to make ends meet. And so my colleague was kind enough to share her research with me so that I can share it with you. So in their study, they found that of their sample, 71% of the workers disclosed side hustles to their employers in some way. Now, typically it was supervisors and coworkers, but for 20% of 21%, it was coworkers only. And many of them, they wanted to disclose because it felt like they were being dishonest. We build these relationships with our organizations, with our employers, and we want to maintain those and be positive, holding something in like that, even if it feels like it's not high stakes, is still challenging and can exhaust you at work. So they wanted to be authentic. They wanted to build good relationships. They wanted to share potentially an opportunity for others to join. And their work is closely tied to their daily life. And so they wanted to make sure that they're living, coherently across those sorts of boundaries. Those that don't disclose primarily were concerned about the negative impact. We do know that individuals, I see this sometimes on like subreddits on this topic, they'll say, how do I ask an employee or ask a candidate if they're working another job? And you'll see people respond and say, why do you need to know? Why do you need to know if it's not affecting their work at all? And this is a really big conflict between, I believe, candidates and workers and employers right now, to sort of figure out what is the boundary of what my organization needs to know. Do they need to be aware? Does it have anything to do with the work I'm doing for them if I'm also, selling a craft on the side? And so I think as we continue to figure out what that tension means and the way that we want to go, organizations need to be really clear about those policies. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So speaking of sort of the manager side of things, they did look at manager reactions to side hustles. And they said that in terms of awareness, like 82% of their sample were aware of employees in their organizations had side hustles, whereas 58% were aware that one of their employees had a side hustle. So generally, it seems like employers know, these days in hiring organizations, employers will Google search and look at the social media, and you can typically find those sorts of things out if you'd like. There's question as to, how useful that is. And there's questions as to maybe sort of the ethics of doing that. But nevertheless, it's happening. And I think this is one way they tend to find out. And then in terms of their views on this, they do, only 17%, even only 8% were worried about burnout, but 17% were, that are concerned about this tension between recognizing initiative. And many were supportive and understanding of it. And what I love the most is that did not consider any of their business. 23% of their sample said, listen, I don't care what I don't care. This isn't my business. But you see this actually pretty even distribution among those who care and those who don't care. And so I think it's important that organizations continue to work on what's their policy, especially as more and more people do it. And I say policy more to be protective of the employee rather than the employer. Even though I do obviously work with employers often and help them with their selection, in this case, I think it's really smart to do that for your employees and make sure they feel that they're supported and the policy is there to protect them. So the employer's perspective. So when we think about employers, this gets a little complicated because there's really these two framings. There's employing workers who do gig work, and then there's contracting with a gig worker. And those are very different things. So employing workers, what we have to really care about from the employer's perspective is you have to understand, like I mentioned, the value of the policy, enforcing the policy. How are you going to enforce the policy? How are you going to communicate? Hey, we Googled and we found that you were, you have this side hustle, and what are you going to do? How are you going to reprimand them? And what's the connection to their performance? That's really what it should be. How is it connecting to the individual's performance? Is it affecting their performance? Because that's the big takeaway from traditional labor. If you're in the traditional labor market, it's about your performance. All work is about performance. But I'm saying what they're doing outside of work should be tied to their performance if an employer is going to bring it up and have an opinion. And then, of course, remembering employment law basics. I'm going to touch on employment law basics very briefly, not from the employer's perspective necessarily, but I am not an employment lawyer. So take that what you will. So contracting with a gig worker is a little different. It's not this employee who you have to give benefits to and then have to manage whether or not they're gigging on the side. It's actually, this is more like a business to business contract, which means you have to have these expectations of deliverables, which means you can't scope creep. And if you do, you have to understand that that's going to come with more costs. And then the question around, do the same employment laws apply? And spoiler is that they really don't to gig workers. So speaking of these legal protections, I have this link in for the Bachman article in the notes here if you'd like it. But what they go on to say is what most people do not know is that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the United States. I did look things up for Canada, but wasn't able to find it quickly enough. I do apologize. I should have done my due diligence there. Covers only employees and not independent contractors and others working in the gig economy. This means that gig workers don't tend to have access to protections and regulations related to minimum wage, overtime, compensation, paid sick leave, and equal pay. Something I don't touch on too much, but I could in a moment, actually after the next slide I will, is about this pay differential. This means classification of workers is a central issue. If you are classifying your workers as an employee, you must pay the benefits. If you are classifying your independent contractors in some way that makes them seem like employees, you must compensate them in a certain way, and you must offer them these benefits and other legal protections. So classification becomes a very big deal. And if there's anyone in the room who does HR, you already know this. I'm preaching to the choir. And I'm aware that there may be folks in the room who work in the space of disability, whether or not that's maybe through research or practice. The relationship between disabilities and gig economy is really interesting, and you see this whether or not you're talking about disabilities or you're talking about any protected class. For a long time, we really felt like the gig economy could offer this opportunity to equalize the playing field, and I think there are ways in which it can do that, but all of these things still exist. All of what happens in like the rest of the labor market, whether or not be through discrimination or these other things, still exist, and they exist in the gig economy too. It's very difficult to study the gig economy in this way, but we know that it's there. And so this fantastic paper by Harper and Blank, happy to send it to you if you'd like. I think did just a really nice job talking about here's what we thought it was going to be. Here's some things that it's actually potentially going to offer, but also here's some challenges that we need to be aware of and create interventions for, create policy for, or empower the workers to manage themselves, and how equipping them with the language they need to ensure that they're getting what they need from this work arrangement. So promising benefits, this is a big thing. So it's access, right? So if you've got a stable internet connection and some sort of product or service to sell, that's access. That's fantastic. That's what we want to see. We want to equalize access to things. It can offer greater flexibility. In every single research project I've done on this topic, flexibility and control over their own work and independence comes up time and time again. And then finally, potentially reducing opportunities to face stigmatization. If you're in the same workplace all the time and people see you every day, anything that might be visible that could be stigmatizing will be seen, and you could have to manage other people's stigmatization of you. However, if you're working totally online and you don't always have to use your camera, whatever that disclosure or concealment looks like for you, you don't always have to face this stigmatization. And that can be a very real benefit. We know from the research on stigma, whether or not we're talking about occupational stigma or someone's personal stigma or group stigma, it's exhausting to manage, and it's especially exhausting to manage on a daily basis. The recovery time is just is so required, and people on a daily basis having to manage that, it can really wear them out. So in some ways, the gig economy can offer sort of a reprieve from that. However, it also comes with a lot of challenges. For example, because we talked about them not having as much access to gig workers, not having as much access to these protections, legal protections, that means disability-related benefits might not be as accessible, and that's a big problem. And then online platforms and organizations aren't necessarily required to provide accommodation for workers who are disabled, because again, they're not employing them. And so they don't have to provide reasonable accommodation, which is legally required in the United States. And I imagine it's also legally required in Canada. So organizations don't have to do that if you're an independent contractor, though. And so you can see some of these drawbacks potentially may outweigh those benefits. But again, equipping disabled gig workers with the language they need to be able to not only request, but actually obtain reasonable accommodation for them to be able to engage in that work is incredibly important. So to summarize here, thinking about just the advantages for gig workers, disadvantages, and then we'll talk the same about employers. Obviously, that flexibility, the autonomy, skill development, control, and potentially increased income if they're willing to sort of put in that labor are definite advantages for gig workers. But disadvantages are very, very present as well. Little protection, little legal protection, time-consuming administrative tasks. I'm sure everyone here is aware that administrative tasks are completely exhausting, and it's no different for freelance workers who have to bill their time and then wait for the individual, then to invoice and wait for them to pay them. We didn't get into that at all here because we didn't have a ton of time to do it, but there are very real administrative burdens that come with freelancing and gig work that gig workers have potentially very little training in, or have trouble sort of being paid sometimes and in a timely way for them to actually for them to pay their own bills. So that training and development is up to the worker. we've got this billable hours family trade-off notion, right? So I could either be billing hours, I could be continuing to drive, I could be continuing to copy edit, I could be continuing to do whatever it is, and instead of spending time either with my family or doing what I want, not necessarily family, just time for yourself. We know that there's this income and gig volatility. Freelancers know this. Sometimes the well dries up. Sometimes it's a good season and you get a lot of clients and you have a lot of interest. And then some seasons are really dry, and that volatility is really requires a lot of planning and forethought. So again, we'll lump that also with administrative tasks in order to do financial planning. And the last one conveniently is that financial planning and organizational skills. Now, for organizations, you get this highly specialized expertise, which is highly desirable, right? You don't have to learn it yourself. You don't have to hire someone and train them and not only pay their base salary, but pay them in incentives and benefits. You're not paying this huge amount of money. You are, farming out exactly what you need, and often getting it. They're lower cost than employee. It's a more competitive talent pool. But at the flip of that one is they might not be able to leverage the depth of the pool, because that's a lot to manage for an organization. And then it allows for scalability. You need a bunch of people to do a bunch of things really quickly. That's great. Seasonal workers around the holidays. A lot of, they used to all flock to malls. I don't know if we go to malls anymore, but, they have a lot of more in-person service in these stores. And then once they're done, they all leave for the season. And so that scalability is really important for organizations to be able to do it quickly, and have it not be as expensive as taking on all this new labor. And then disadvantages. So worker classification, this is a huge problem. There was a Microsoft case in 1999 that, if you're interested at all, I recommend you look into that. And I believe Microsoft lost. They weren't able to actually convince them, because the independent contractors were working so closely and were treated like employees in every other way, that they brought a suit and said, we're employees here and we're not getting benefits. Incomplete projects, unfulfilled expectations. You have this problem with employees too, but with gig workers, especially remote, sometimes that feels like a larger risk. And then, like I mentioned, not being able to potentially fully leverage the depth of the talent pool. And so I'll leave it there for questions. I hope I left enough time. I think you guys had mentioned about at 40 past, I should be done. So we're right there.
Perfect timing, Emily. Thank you so much for this presentation. I know that I have learned a lot, even though we seem to have a very knowledgeable audience with us today with that poll up top. I do think that there's so many layers and different perspectives and points of view around gig economy that I think were really valuable, and really happy to jump into the question and answer period with our audience. And I'll just do a quick reminder for those that were so enveloped and don't remember how to communicate with us from the beginning. We do have our question and answer function right in that bottom toolbar of your Zoom, and you can utilize that to connect with us for questions. And again, it does have that option to be anonymous or go through privately if that's feeling more comfortable for you. But I'll just jump right into a question we already have. Thinking about COVID-19, obviously that is something that's heavily affected us for the last few years, and wondering if there's any long-term impact that COVID-19 may have brought up for the remote work, the precarious employment, the gig economy. Has it increased the number of workers? Just any kind of impact or insight you may be able to provide.
Yeah, this is a great question. So when COVID-19 sort of started, my colleague and I actually were working on the paper that I mentioned with those 4 subtypes, and we were working with an organization in the United States that helps sort of unite, we'll say, freelance workers, and they were putting out surveys often trying to figure out what was going on. So I'll say the immediate impact was hugely damaging. You had a lot, as I'm sure you would have already guessed. Over time, though, we have seen sort of, we'll say, patterns in who's dropping out of the labor market. I think that's probably general knowledge now that we know that a lot more women during COVID dropped out. That I don't believe there's any reason to think that that didn't happen also to women who do freelance or gig work. However, gig work, there are some estimates that suggest that more women do gig work than men. And we can sort of see and understand why that would happen, that there are more, it tends to be more flexible. So if they're working around a caregiving schedule, bringing in the extra money for the family, which I always hate to say, the money that women bring in is just like extra cash. But in this way, if they're caregivers also, then that's what they can do. Increase the number in precarious employment. I don't know the numbers on that. I'll say that theoretically, it wouldn't surprise me if we saw people who tended to engage in more gig work once things started opening up to potentially make up for some of the financial loss they may have that may have occurred in their lives during COVID. But I don't know if I don't believe we've seen like some sort of spike or some sort of increase that's notable since 2020. Your second question I see here, have there been changes in the amount of equity seeking groups? May I ask for a clarification, because I have some notes here, but I want to make sure that I'm actually answering your question, because there is some research. There's a study out of Stanford that looks at differences in pay for Uber drivers, look at comparing men and women. I believe it's Stanford. And they actually find that women are still underpaid there. So I think in line with this notion around, we thought that it would be really helpful for individuals who have disabilities, any protected group. We thought this would be an equalizing force, because it's just us individuals working directly with, a client or customer, rather than having to deal with the sort of the employment. But I have theorized, since I started working on this, have not tested it yet, that there's no reason to believe these individuals wouldn't face some of the same challenges in getting gig work that they face getting traditional labor. So I hope that answers your question. I see. May I read them, Elizabeth? Is that
Yeah,
okay? Is that your job? I want to take your job.
No, you're doing great. So if you want to continue going, and there's other channels that we're getting some, so I can jump in when needed.
Great, perfect, thank you. Oh, good, Tom. I'm glad to answer your question. Okay, Steve Horvath, how much work has been done on the long-term mental impact of gig work on workers? Are there gender differences? This is a great question. So the way we would test this, I don't know of anything explicitly right now. The way we would test this obviously would be to compare those of mental health of gig workers versus traditional workers. And this is the part we just don't know yet. We want to believe, I think, from this notion around gig work and being the person who has to hustle to get all these jobs, that's harder, more challenging, requires more personal resources than a traditional job. I don't know if we can make that claim, particularly given when we say traditional job, we're speaking across skill levels, pay levels, industry. I don't know if we can make that assumption. I would say, in not a great response to your question, would be potentially we would see people who aren't as I don't want to say capable in a bad way, because it is a very stressful thing. I do some side work, and it's exhausting sometimes to manage clients and find new work, or take on new work and manage all of that. So I don't really want to call it sort of capability. It's more those who maybe aren't motivated to do all of that managing will fall out of gig work. And so they'll end up hopefully getting what they want with a full-time traditional job, if that's what they want. So I think more than anything, we will see this self-selection over time. And actually, it's one thing some researchers have noticed sort of already is, or proposed already, that those who don't fit in it, just like a normal job, just like I don't want to say normal, I shouldn't have said normal, just like a traditional sort of 9-to-5 job, those who don't fit that culture are eventually going to leave. So I hope that answers some of your question. Differences in stress and wellness. I have not seen much difference here. I've not seen much research on it. It wouldn't surprise me if we found that it was more that women suffered more than men with some of these mental health issues, or we'll say stress and well-being issues. That's more accurate, because I can speak to that. I don't study mental health, but well-being issues in circumstances where they are also, home manager, caregiver. So if they're doing all of those things as well, and then taking on additional labor, I see no reason why they would not be at higher risk of burnout and things like that, given the other factors that are playing in their lives. I hope that answers your question there too. like I'm half answering some of these questions. Sorry.
No, it's wonderfully thorough and bringing in all of these different lenses and research that you're aware of, which is so wonderful. So maybe to follow up on that concept of burnout, I know you mentioned it in your presentation as well. Are there recommendations or things that you're seeing that can support people in gig workers around burnout and addressing it for themselves?
Oh, I'm glad this was asked because I didn't have time to put it in my presentation, but I would say there's an evolving list of best practice, sort of well-being best practices for gig workers that have a lot to do, and maybe this will surprise you, maybe it won't, around empowerment of creating sort of scheduling, but also determining who you're going to take on as a client and who you're not. So this notion of you don't have to say yes to everybody. Do your planning, do your financial planning, do your organizing, and figure out how much money you need to make, and then say yes to those opportunities that excite you, that feed you, that are putting you in a position where you're doing the things that you want to do. Now, I don't want to make it sound like we should always, our work we should always love. I love my work and I don't always love my work. Like there are times where I'm working on things I'm like, I would really much rather be hanging out with my cats. In fairness, I don't always be rather doing that, but I'd rather be doing something else, right? I'd rather be engaging in some sort of artistic project or something. So we don't always have to love our work, but certainly feeling empowered to make determinations of who to say yes to and who to say no to. Again, that planning, it's like I tell my students all the time, the best self-care is planning and preparing. And that sounds not profound at all, but imagine sort of me coming here with like no slides and just winging it. It would be terrible. And so I wasn't stressed about this because I had a plan and I knew what I was supposed to do. And I won't need time to recover after this. I can just sit down and get back to work and do other things. So I think one, being empowered to say yes and no to things you do want to do and things you don't. Understand there are times you're going to have to do some of those things, and being just the best planner that you can be. Create those systems, create that scheduling. If you are the type of person who can do more than one thing at once, power to you. Most people can, even though we think we can. I am one of those people that says she can and she can't, but creating those schedules in ways that work for you. Sometimes that means having two planners. I've seen a lot of workers do this. Sometimes that means physically being somewhere else for certain roles that you're playing, wearing different clothes for different roles that you're playing. So you can bring in that mindset and say, this is what I'm doing right now. Creating time, especially if you're a creative or if you have to sit down and if you're a copywriter and the project is really cerebral and you need to just sit there and focus, we call it chunking. So chunking that time to say, these are 4 hours I'm doing this and I'm not budging. So it's having and communicating that scheduling with your family as well. So I've said a couple of things here. I wish I remembered all of them that I did in order, but a lot of these things that feel like regular business planning, that's self-care, because then once you're done, you're done. So you did your work on this project, you've done it well, send it off. Now either move on to the next or take the time that you need. So we have this evolving list of ideas that aren't really that profound, but that people forget to do for themselves. And that means maybe actually I'd never say a Monday morning is when you should sit and plan. Friday afternoon, spend the last 20 minutes planning your next week, right? And that can really help, because then you hit the ground running on Monday and you don't have to worry about it on Saturday and Sunday. So those sorts of thinking of yourself, a week from now, what would help them? I hope those make sense.
Absolutely. Some of those tried and true methods, right, are those golden nuggets that come up again and again. And we're like, right. I do know these things. And I just need that kind of helpful reminder. Yeah. So if we're looking a little bit to the future, and there's a few dynamics to this question, it seems fairly clear that the gig economy isn't going anywhere. So when we look to the future, how do we address some of these things to really highlight and maintain the positives that you've greatly discussed and why people go into it, but maybe bring some more structure or formalities around those negatives to help the equity seeking groups or the people that maybe aren't there by choice, or to bring some protective things. Just any insights on how we can have a bright future for gig economy, perhaps, is a way to phrase it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I had thought of this question beforehand so that I could sit and think about it a little bit. So the notion being, how can we maximize all these positives and minimize those negatives? So if you don't mind, I'm going to go back to sort of the advantages and disadvantages to remind myself.
Absolutely.
Right. So One thing that also seems sort of small and sort of part, and is part of the self-care element, is working with other gig workers. So understanding that not all other gig workers who are doing what you're doing are competition. They could be your support. They have things, they understand things that you maybe don't understand, and they can really help you in this way. And this actually occurred through, I saw this a lot through, especially during COVID, when we were doing some research and collecting data. We saw individuals saying, like, I am isolated here. I really need to get in contact with other gig workers and see how they're managing it. So increasing the positives that way through just finding your people. I know people use the term like finding your tribe or something, like finding your people who are doing something similar, who you guys can support each other, is incredibly important. As for sort of I'm going to lean toward the organizational side right now, if you don't mind. I think, and this is such a cop-out answer, and I don't mean it as a cop-out, but making people aware of what the gig economy is bringing value to, not just in the marketplace, but to the individual. So if you are an employer and you find out that one of your workers is doing something on the side, and you're afraid that they're burnt out, I would recommend that instead of automatically assuming they can't perform, they're incapable of managing these things, which you shouldn't be. Let's hope you're not assuming those things about your employees right away. That instead it's a conversation with them and asking them more about it, and seeing, why don't you see what happens if you try to offer them support? Why don't you see if there's an opportunity, or be open to the notion that maybe what they're doing outside, they're bringing some of that in, not always maybe technical skills, but we know that if you have a great experience in domain A, you're going to bring that attitude home. Right? So, or bring that attitude to the domain B. I say home because most of the time the research is, you have a crappy day at work, you go home and you're in a crappy mood. And so instead, recognizing that the value of what they're doing outside of work has value inside of work. And we have to be open to maybe that. I don't want to blur that domain too much. I want to keep employees safe, and not feeling like they always have to be on at work or communicating with work, but recognizing that there's some benefit from it, instead of assuming automatically that your employee isn't capable. And then instead of, let's say they're having a hard time and they're really overwhelmed with their gig work on the side, instead of saying, you can't do this anymore because it's interrupting your work here, maybe instead talk to them about what you can do to be supportive. Maybe they can go part-time for a while. Maybe there's other things you can do to help support something else that they're doing, because there's a reason they're doing it. There's a reason they're doing it. It might be financial, in which case you should take a hard look at how that's reflecting on you as the employer. Not that it's always within your control, believe me, I know that, but if it's not financial, then it's maybe personal, and what are they getting out of that, and how it's really important that they still maintain that and cultivate that for themselves. I'm not saying organizations should be more involved in people's lives, but when we're thinking of our relationships with our supervisors and our leaders, those sorts of relationships can help. In terms of protecting our gig workers a little bit more, there have been efforts. So out of California a few years ago, we saw a couple laws one or two laws trying to be pushed on Uber drivers, and saying the job they're doing is the core of the business. And if the job they're doing is the core of the business, they are employees. This business would not exist without them. They should be employees, and they should have benefits. This type of regulation was so complicated at the time because you had so many people who were doing other types of freelance work or consulting work in California who were saying, we want these individuals who want protection, we want them to have protection, but this would mean that I'm losing all of my freelance work, whatever that might mean. So by the definition that was being proposed in this bill, I'm losing all of my work, and I like my work the way it is. I don't want to work for an organization. So I actually don't have a single recommendation for regulation, because the moment we try to put parameters on it, there are going to be people who lose, and there will be people who win, and there will be people who lose. And probably that dichotomy is not great. There will be people who benefit in a way that they want to benefit, and then there will be people who don't want that protection because they don't feel they need it. So I think not treating them like a monolith helps, but unfortunately, I don't have a policy recommendation, because I think a policy would treat them like a homogeneous group, and they aren't, as we saw with the California bill. That I actually don't remember what ultimately happened with that. Unfortunately, I lost track.
Thank you so much. It's so many layers. And as we're seeing, this whole gig economy is very layered. And I appreciate all of your efforts and going to all of the different nooks and crannies in your answer. Just looking at the time, I'll squeeze in one last question before we wrap for the day. And it does speak a little bit to this to this non-traditional maybe employer, but still having employees when we think about maybe those larger ones.
Yeah.
Where do you see the responsibility of those larger ones? You've mentioned a couple, so I'll use the same examples: Uber Eats, Etsy, those things,
Yeah.
in being transparent and what this kind of work means, but also maybe is there a role for them when it comes to the reasons you mentioned people go in, the career development, the flexibility? Like, is there something that can strengthen that relationship? And also maybe from the employee side around being advocates for themselves, when you mentioned scope creep or other things like that, just where does this relationship, maybe wanting to talk a little bit about that?
With like an Uber, you're saying? So like an Uber
Yeah.
they don't employ, they're all independent contractors, right? So Uber drivers are independent contractors. And I have often wondered this question of like, what obligation, what responsibility does, Uber HQ have to the thousands and thousands and thousands of drivers that are using their platform in order to make money. I think that's such a philosophical question, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I haven't thought about it too deeply in so many years. I'd like to think that I'd like to think they're collecting data and sort of monitoring, not in a bad way, but monitoring sort of if they're ensuring that they're meeting the needs of their independent contractors. But I wonder if it's just such a large number that they treat them sort of all the same. I don't know if they feel that obligation, and I don't know if I don't know the data on that, so I don't want to speak too far from it.
No,
I'm so sorry.
Sure. Or maybe then to just wrap there around any recommendations for those that might be attending and a gig worker themselves of how to advocate for themselves, what if they're dealing in that or something, and then we'll wrap there for the day. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, because that was your second question and I forgot it. So advocating for yourself means writing down exactly what you need and why, and what value it's going to bring to that organization. Now that does fall on you. That falls on you to do, and I'm so sorry. But for individuals who might not understand what that means, why you need extra time, why you need, maybe a particular type of a machine or whatever it is, you need to be the one to write it down and say why, and not be afraid to say, this is what I need. I'm a good worker. You'll see my background, look at my resume, look at my productivity. If you're on Upwork or something, I'm bring value to the organization, but I need a couple things, and these aren't unreasonable. Could go as far as to even calculate the cost of it for them. But the first step is absolutely asking for what you need. Don't ever be afraid to ask for what you need. People might say no. I mean, my students ask me for things all the time. I don't say no that often, but you have, the first step is actually feeling empowered enough to say, this is what I need to be successful here, and I will be of value to your organization, whether or not that's through gig work or traditional employment.
Thank you so much. We will wrap it here, as I know we've gone 1 minute over, so I'll steal another minute. No, that's on me too. No apologies here. It's been just such a thoughtful and thorough conversation. I didn't want to cut any thoughts off. So thank you so much, first off, to you, Emily, for being here with us today, bringing forward all of this wonderful discussion. Thank you to our audience for being so participatory and learning more about this gig economy. I think I can confidently say we're all walking away with maybe some new thoughts, perspectives, and things we can bring back into our work life, whatever that may look like. So again, just a big thank you to everyone, and a quick reminder, we have been recording. You will receive the presentation recording as well as the materials directly through email, or you can find it on our eCampus. Again, our WWI Work Wellness Institute members will receive a free certificate of attendance. If that's perked your ear of what does that mean, please feel free to go to our website, workwellnessinstitute.org, and look at the Join Us section to look at all of the wonderful benefits becoming a member provides you. And if you have any questions, you can reach out directly to membership services at workwellnessinstitute.org for any member questions. I will let you know that we have an evaluation survey that we'd be so very thankful for you to fill out. It will pop up as soon as we've ended the webinar. You might get a pop-up saying to direct you to a third party. That's us. That's our evaluation survey. Please follow through and just take those couple of minutes, as we do greatly appreciate it and truly use this feedback to ensure our programming continues to be relevant for our audience. All of our webinars are created for public access and supported by memberships and funding sponsors. And if you want to keep up with us in terms of our full programming, please visit the courses section and resources section of our website. And there you can see everything upcoming, everything that's happened in the past, and just stay up to date on all of our educational resources. And you might even be joining us later in April on the 18th for our workshop on accommodating for mental health related disabilities in the workplace. So I'll end it there. Thank you again so much, Emily, for spending your time with us. Thank you to our audience, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.